Yet nothing in a nation's lifetime would promise to outlast the wonder of man's greatest adventure.
We Came in Peace, narrated by Frank McGee. Produced by NBC News. For the Gulf Oil Corporation.
It was the beginning of a journey that really has no foreseeable end. In a unique era, when for the first time in human history, man is finding at least partial answers to riddles that have always haunted him. Where did the moon come from? And what was the Earth like billions of years ago? The keys to understanding lie in drab, gray, porous-looking rocks, 250,000 miles from their home. Amazingly, the journey between man's aspiration to get to the moon and man's actual capacity to do so took only a dozen years. Until 1957, his restless imagination had stretched far beyond his technology. More than 100 years ago, Jules Verne wrote two remarkable accounts of lunar voyages, From the Earth to the Moon and its sequel, Around the Moon. And later, the three men, recognized as the fathers of space flight, Goddard, Tsiolkovsky, and Oberth, were all to say they traced their early interest in aeronautics to these prophetic novels. And there is an amazing parallel between them and Apollo's ventures into space a century later. Incredibly, Verne's fictional launch site was just 140 miles west of Cape Kennedy. Verne thought he could propel his spacecraft from the barrel of a mighty cannon 900 feet long. But his moonship was shaped somewhat like Apollo and also built to carry the hardy adventurers. He called them aeronauts. Verne's basic calculation to escape Earth's gravity, 7 miles a second, was substantially correct. And he wrote of weightlessness. They saw that they were no longer subject to the ordinary laws of nature. They looked like drunken men trying to maintain the perpendicular. Apart from minor details, Verne's description of the lunar surface stands almost unchanged. He talked of desert beds, immense plains, and cavities in the midst of circles. 1910, Verne's cosmic voyage caught the fascination and restless imagination of another Frenchman, Georges Méliès. The film remains a classic. Two decades later, German director Fritz Lang's Girl in the Moon, for which rocket pioneer Hermann Oberth was technical advisor. A puree of science and melodrama. Oberth was one of three pioneering scientists closely linked to early drama of manned spaceflight. But he was more of a theoretician and an inspiration than an engineer. A second was an obscure Russian teacher of mathematics, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, who wrote the first technical paper on the idea of an artificial Earth satellite. But in terms of experimentation, it was an American, Robert Goddard, whose combined theory and practice marked a major scientific turning point in history. As early as 1914, he secured 2 patents introducing the essential features of every modern liquid-fueled rocket. Unknown and unsung, except in scientific circles, Goddard pursued his experiments on New Mexico ranch land. The quiet and persistent physics professor made more than 40 successful, unpublicized rocket tests. Stimulated by both Oberth and Goddard, the Germans had already launched a number of small rockets. At Peenemünde, the vast military installation on the Baltic Sea, the research task force was headed by a civilian engineer, Werner von Braun. There were initial frustrations. But eventually, the Germans developed and successfully fired more than 3,700 V-2 rocket weapons on targets in England and on the continent. At war's end, von Braun and his know-how surrendered to the United States. Partially dismantled V-2s were sent here and reassembled at the Army's newly opened White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, only 100 miles from where Goddard had spent his golden years. During a 5-year period after World War II, 66 rockets were tested.
2, 1, 0.
Many carried plant life and animals, and with each success, the fledgling American rocket industry was on its way. In 1950, White Sands became too confining. Testing moved eastward. They came to what, a dozen years earlier, had been a desolate triangle of sand dunes and swamps, palm trees, and a dense tangle of underbrush. In isolated patches, the terrain would begin to sprout gantries and other contours of the new science. There would be improbable successes and spectacular failures. Suddenly, there was Sputnik. Russia put into orbit the world's first artificial satellite. It would decay after 3 months, but its impact would continue well beyond that brief lifetime. In the United States, there was more soul-searching than at any time since Pearl Harbor, and just 2 months after Sputnik, this nation had high hopes for its initial effort to get back into the space race, Project Vanguard. Swarms of newsmen descended on the Cape to watch. I was one of them.
Huge red and white checkered gantry tower has now been pulled aside and brought back a distance of perhaps 200 yards to completely expose the 3-stage rocket to view. Here she goes. Flame is shooting out from under the bottom of it. And a huge, huge ball of fire rising up perhaps 100 feet. Apparently we've had some kind of difficulty on the pad. I do not see the missile rising into the air. The flame has gone out and black smoke is rising and curling off westward as the wind whips in from the sea. Certainly it was a failure. We don't know what the cause was, but the missile has been destroyed and fire hoses are now playing on the launching pad. 29 months of intensive labor, $100 million of expenditure has just gone up in a huge red-orange ball of smoke. We don't know, we will not know for some time what caused the failure.
With American embarrassment at its apex, these 1957 frustrations focused mainly on the military implications of the Soviet achievement. It had been a great blow to American self-confidence. For every small success, there had been at least one failure. The moment then was particularly sweet in early 1958, when we partially redeemed ourselves with the first United States satellite in orbit, Explorer 1. By midsummer of that year, the newly created National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, had been assigned the first manned satellite program, to be called Mercury. The great push into space science was on. The first group of American astronaut candidates began training in 1959, subjected to virtually every extreme of physical and psychological stress. Among them, acceleration up to 15 Gs. But the astronauts seemed less concerned than the scientists. Most had been college-educated as engineers, yet first and foremost, they were military test pilots. Out of 36 finalists, 7 were chosen to be this nation's nominees for the first American voyagers into space. 3 naval officers, 3 from the Air Force, 1 a Marine, all with natural aptitude, drive, and dedication. Chance, circumstance, and history had prepared them for this opportunity, but only one could be first, Navy Lieutenant Commander Alan Shepard.
Certainly all of us wanted very much to make the flight, and I'm sure that had anyone else had the opportunity, he would have been equally proud as I was on that day, having been selected to go first. There was a wide difference of of opinion as to how man would react under weightless conditions for a period as long as 5 minutes at a time. This was pretty traumatic concern among some members of the medical community. And Glenn and Grissom and myself actually went to Navy facility in Johnsville, Pennsylvania, where a centrifuge was prepared for our special use to run some more tests to, in fact, indicate that we could respond very well to weightlessness for periods as long as 5 minutes at a time.
Ironically, it was not Shepard, but a Russian who would remove any lingering medical qualms about weightlessness. The Soviet Union firmly established its lead in the international space race when cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first man to orbit the Earth for 89 minutes in April 1961. Once again, as with Sputnik, the United States space effort seemed sluggish. Shepard, meantime, intensified his training for America's pioneering mission.
The actual launching of the first flight, of course, occurred on May 5th. The entire suiting process went very smoothly. Actually, first time I was really aware of any tremendous amount of activity was as the transportation trailer, which took us in those days from the hangar to the launching pad, approached the area. There were, of course, a number of people that wished me well as I walked from the transport van to the elevator. And then as the elevator went up from the ground to the station where I was going to be put into the spacecraft, there was a tremendous round of applause. Actually, before I knew it, I was inside, the hatch was closed, and I was lying there quietly waiting for the countdown to proceed. The ignition and liftoff occurred very smoothly. I think perhaps more smoothly than I'd expected. Very gentle transition from 1G to slow increase in acceleration. But generally speaking, beyond that, it was a very smooth flight. A second suborbital flight was made with Gus Grissom at the controls. It was essentially the same as mine and was so successful, the decision to make any further suborbital flights was canceled, and we went directly into the manned orbital phase. John Glenn, who had been my backup pilot, was selected to fly the first orbital mission, and my particular responsibility during this flight was to act as communicator in the control center at the Cape.
6:03 a.m., February 20th, 1962. The operations team atop Pad 14 noted in its procedures log, the astronaut put a foot into the spacecraft. John Glenn would sit there during a series of holds dragging through more than 2 hours. But then he'd waited almost 3 long years for this moment.
Status check, pressurization. Lock stacking. Have a blinking high level light. You are go. Water systems, go. Range operations. Mercury capsule, go.
May the wee ones be with you, Thomas.
Good Lord, ride all the way. Godspeed, John Glenn. 5, 4, 3, 2, 0. Roger, backup clock is started. Roger, loud and clear. Flight path is good. 6-9.
First American to orbit the globe, and reaction everywhere. A mixture of relief, pride, and exaltation. Honors and celebrations. 250,000 persons lined the rainy streets of Washington to pour out unstinting admiration. Then on to New York to travel the glory road of other heroes. A ticker-tape parade, bands and banners, chimes and cheers. The first American to ever see the coastlines of continents from outer space said he'd never seen anything like this. With the Glenn flight a success, American industry more firmly hitched its wagon to the infinite, and the money flowed. Project Gemini, the two-man spacecraft, involved more than 25,000 persons, 50 major contractors, and 150 smaller firms. When the late President John Kennedy announced in mid-1961 that this nation would land men on the moon in this decade, the goal seemed unrealistic, even to many scientists. But the momentum of Gemini, once underway in 1965, was almost irresistible. There were high achievements and relatively few disappointments. There were 10 manned missions stretching over 20 months. With almost clockwork precision, a new shot was put up every 6 to 8 weeks. Astronauts successfully completed rendezvous 10 times using 7 different techniques. The ability to rendezvous and dock 2 space vehicles in orbit would be fundamental to the success of a moon landing. 9 different dockings with another space object were made. Extravehicular activity successfully tested man's ability to function independently of the protection afforded by a spacecraft. Colonel Edward White was the first American to walk in space. 4 others also floated outside their Gemini craft or poked their bodies through an open hatch. Some things about space can only be learned in space. Astronauts built on experience, the process never stopping. The skills of maneuvering, a tested worldwide recovery force and tracking network, making precise landings from orbit, proving man could live and work in space in weightlessness for as long as 2 weeks, a period far longer than necessary for Apollo's round trip to the moon. And always the happy return to private worlds, home. 16 astronauts had flown a total of more than 1,900 hours around the world 608 times. There were airy visions of the Apollo challenge ahead, and we entered the climatic venture with justifiable confidence. Pad 34, late in January 1967. Optimism was high as the crew of the first Apollo mission, Edward White, Virgil Gus Grissom, and Roger Chaffee, just 3 weeks away from their scheduled flight, took part in a full-scale simulation of the launching. They would crawl into their spacecraft, one of the most complex pieces of machinery yet devised by man. Knowledge of risk is basic to any pioneering venture, but not one man had ever been lost or even hurt. It was taking too much for granted, for when it came suddenly, and where least expected, on the launching pad. Grissom, White, and Chaffee died in flames, a flash fire that broke out in the cockpit. Astronauts had worked in pure oxygen atmospheres before, hundreds of thousands of times without incident. The probability of accident was small. Apollo engineers were willing to take the gamble, but in manned spaceflight, errors are unforgivable. Maybe Ed White provided the best epitaph for himself and for those who might inevitably follow. He once said, "We're in a risky business. The conquest of any frontier always extracts a human toll." Afterwards, a special board of review uncovered many deficiencies in design, engineering, and manufacturing, noting particularly the lack of absolute control over all flammable materials, the lack of attention to vital questions of crew safety. The way back would not be easy. Emotions were on edge, and there would be constant reminders that the program had paid dearly for one period of overconfidence. The company which built the spacecraft would go through one of the most agonizing periods a firm can experience. But in a grim way, the tragedy would contribute to later successes. It would be a year before a redesigned spacecraft left the plant, modified at a cost of $400 million, and more than 20 months for the program to regain momentum. There would be 2 tests of the giant Saturn V rocket and an unmanned flight of the lunar module. Yet confidence would not be completely restored until Apollo 7, late in 1968, the first of the last bold steps to the moon. The urge to explore, to stretch the soul, goes deep. But Apollo would not be a lonely journey by dreamers in search of an unknown shore. Like frontiersmen of the past, our spacefarers had picked the nearest big landmark, the moon. It was large, it was handy, it was available. Anything else would have been too difficult a first step. For millennia, man has gazed at the moon. A century ago, he first captured it on film. With modern telescopes, he studied it in more detail. He's conjured up ways to signal it, sunlight off a gigantic mirror, a field of electric lights in this 1920 film, by which he could flash Morse code. Hello, is anybody out there? But until July 1964, our knowledge of the moon changed very little. Both the United States and Russia had launched unmanned lunar probes in the late 1950s with very little success. The United States, in fact, was not able to hit the moon until after years of delay and 7 failures. Russia's Luna finally passed within 40,000 miles of the lunar surface. Luna 3 in 1959 made the first crude pictures of the far side of the moon. Later, American spacecraft were sent aloft as reconnaissance vehicles. 17,000 pictures were relayed back to Earth by 3 Rangers, which hard landed on the surface. These were the first close-ups, 2,000 times better than anything ever taken through earthbound telescopes. The next epical stage in lunar photography was Surveyor, with soft landings on the surface. Like Ranger, to gather information essential to ever land astronauts safely. Surveyor scanned, pounded, and scraped the surface, and dissipated fears that the lunarscape might be unable to support the weight of a manned spacecraft. The results of these shots, including pictures taken by lunar orbiting spacecraft, were 5 potential touchdown sites for the Apollo 11 astronauts, smooth enough and strong enough to make that landing safe. By 1968, it was dramatically evident how far space technology had progressed. The Kennedy Space Center was complete, and the puny pads from which Vanguard and Explorer had been launched were now dwarfed by enormous rockets, huge crawlers, and vast sums of money. The new launch philosophy was to build a rocket one place and send it up from another. 4 manned Apollo missions were executed with precision. 2 flights went to the moon as scouting parties for those that would land later. First, Apollo 8.
Apollo 8, Houston, what does the old moon look like from 60 miles, over?
Okay, Houston. The moon is essentially gray. No color. Looks like plaster of Paris. Or sort of a grayish beach sand. You can see quite a bit of detail. The equator craters are all rounded off. There's quite a few of them. Some of them are newer. Many of them look like, especially the round ones, look like hit by meteorites or projectiles of some sort. Hello, Houston, Houston. This is Snoopy.
Right, Snoop, go ahead.
We is going. We is down among them, Charlie. I tell you, we're down here where we can touch the top of some hills, though.
Apollo 10 surveyed and photographed the target area for 11. The landing point, designated as site number 2, was near the lunar equator in the Sea of Tranquility in the east zone. Flat, stable, and with only small craters nearby, extending emptily to the horizon. It harbored no insurmountable hazards to a manned landing. With Apollo 10 in lunar orbit, the 11 rocket had already been moved into position on the launch pad.
Boy, this view has got to be a fantastic thing.
Mid-July 1969, the moment was close. The mighty armada was gathered. Billions of dollars, millions of man-hours of research, thousands of persons mobilized, all the complex systems and devices flight tested. The launch team had been working through 5 intense months of assembly and checkout. and double-check. Centuries of dreaming, a decade of planning near to climax, and a special breed of 20th century explorer, the men of Apollo 11, would soon be on their way. Michael Collins, 38. His motto, stay casual. Edwin Aldrin Jr., 39. Part engineer, part scientist. Spacecraft Commander Neil Armstrong, 39. Not a man for small moments. All three supremely self-confident pilots who liked action, highly disciplined minds of extraordinary stability. The cool, the quick, the cerebral. The day was bright and sunny. Engineers in the firing room read off data flashing across their consoles, showing that all was going well with the countdown.
1, 0, all engines running, commit.
The moment of truth. With the same punctuality as previous flights, the mighty rocket's first stage engines roared to flaming life. It was precisely 9:32 a.m. Eastern Time, July 16th. The rocket's more than 15 million parts worked flawlessly. Thousands of birdwatchers stood near the beaches at Cape Kennedy. Millions of others watched on television.
This is Houston, you are go for staging.
There were not just 3 men aboard Apollo 11, but something of mankind.
11 Houston, thrust is go. All engines, you're looking good.
Houston, a real good picture we're getting here. We see a real display now.
For the astronauts, the 71.5 hour journey to the vicinity of the moon and insertion into lunar orbit was almost routine. And the spacecraft's course was so accurate that only one small navigation correction was necessary.
The doorway, he's waiting there for you, and he turns the lights on. How about that? It's like the refrigerator.
With the command module, called Columbia, and the lunar module, christened Eagle, connected, they circled the moon for a day. Then on that historic Sunday, Armstrong and Aldrin wriggled through the tunnel into Eagle.
Roger.
Unlocking from Columbia, Eagle stayed close by for more than 20 minutes. Most of the trip down would be flown automatically or semi-automatically. And when Eagle reached 50,000 feet, Armstrong and Aldrin would blast their rocket to slow themselves down. And for 12 minutes, the engine would roar continuously as Eagle fell along a steadily sharpening path to the moon.
Fine looking flying machine there, Eagle, despite the fact you're upside down. Somebody's upside down.
Altitude 4200.
Houston, you're a go for landing, over. Roger, understand, go for landing, 3,000 feet. Copy. Alarm. 1201. 1201. Roger, 1201 alarm. We're go, same type, we're go. Lights on. Down 2.5. Forward. Forward. Good. 40 feet down 2.5. Picking up some dust. 30 feet, 2.5 down. Straight shadow. 4 forward. 4 forward. Drift into the right a little. 20. Down 1/2. 30 seconds. Forward. Just. Good. Okay. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot. Houston, the Mesa came down. All right.
Not until later would we learn that an overworked computer had been guiding Eagle toward a boulder-filled crater, Armstrong grabbing manual control to steer over the rocks to a smooth, safe spot for landing. Once ready, Armstrong opened the hatch and slowly, gingerly moved down the ladder. Aldrin remained inside. Just a few feet below was the curious lunar soil, but first Armstrong would pause on the disc-like footpad at the end of the ladder.
Roger.
Moon watchers, 1/5 of the world's population, 600 million eyewitnesses shared one of mankind's greatest moments through live television transmission.
Okay. I'm at the foot of the ladder. The LEM footpads are only depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches, although the surface appears to be very, very fine-grained as you get close to it. It's almost like a powder. Ground mass is very fine.
Momentarily, centuries of speculation about the lunar surface and man's ability to survive there would be over. It was 10:56 p.m. Eastern Time.
I'm going to step off the LEM now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Aldrin, the second man on the moon, followed Armstrong within 20 minutes.
Beautiful view. Isn't that something? Magnificent sight out here. Magnificent desolation.
The two astronauts uncovered a small stainless steel plaque on the forward landing gear, a plaque to mark the landing.
For those who haven't read the plaque, we'll read the plaque that's on the front landing gear of this LEM. There's 2 hemispheres, one showing each of the 2 hemispheres of Earth. Underneath it says, "Dear men from the planet Earth, first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind." It has the crew members' signatures and the signature of the President of the United States.
Overhead, Collins in the command ship Columbia could hear, but not watch, the unfolding drama.
Columbia, this is Houston reading you loud and clear. Right, the EVA is progressing beautifully. I believe they're setting up the flag now.
Great.
I guess you're about the only person around that doesn't have TV coverage of the scene.
That's all right, I don't mind a bit. Is the lighting halfway decent?
Yes, indeed. They've got the flag up now.
Beautiful, just beautiful. All right, you do have to be rather careful to keep track of where your center of mass is. Sometimes it takes about 2 or 3 paces to make sure that you've got your feet underneath you. That 2 or 3 or maybe 4 easy paces can bring you to a fairly smooth stop direction. Like a football player, you just have to put out to the side and cut a little bit. So-called kangaroo hop does work, but it seems your forward stability is not quite as good.
Neil and Buzz, the President of the United States is in his office now and would like to say a few words to you. Over.
That would be an honor.
Hello, Neil and Buzz. I'm talking to you by telephone from the Oval Room at the White House. And this certainly has to be the most historic telephone call ever made from the White House. I just can't tell you how proud we all are of what you have done.
And as you talk to us from the Sea of Tranquility, it inspires us to redouble our efforts to bring peace and tranquility to Earth. For one priceless moment in the whole history of man, all on this Earth are truly one. Thank you, Mr. President.
Altogether, inside and outside their moonship, Armstrong and Aldrin spent nearly a day in this strange, literally unearthly place. They did what they came to do. Then in the 21st hour came the last real moment of high tension. If the rocket engine failed on liftoff, they would be condemned to death, a 250,000 miles away from home.
Proceed. Beautiful. 26, 36 feet per second up. 5 for the pitch over.
The fragile Eagle rocketed away from Tranquility Base, firing on time, boosting the mooncraft into a long, elliptical path toward the command ship cruising in orbit overhead. Worldwide, there were sighs of relief and prayers of thanks. From Kobe to Quito came words of congratulations. Even Moscow noted the flight with the widest Soviet news coverage ever given an American space venture. The rendezvous chase in which Eagle would catch up with Columbia would take more than 3 hours.
Ag degrees within a foot per second.
The chase would end 60 nautical miles above the front of the moon, in an orbit where Collins remained in lonely vigil. Not since Adam, perhaps, had one man ever known such solitude. Eagle and Columbia would rejoin. Armstrong and Aldrin would crawl through a connecting tunnel and rejoin Collins. Half a day later, Apollo 11 would break out of lunar gravity and head for home. "57 hours later, it would thread the needle of entry into Earth environment and splash down in the Pacific Ocean. The moment would be part history, part holiday, claim of Apollo 11 in the record of man, secure. Left behind, visible, mute evidence of their visit, footprints in magnificent desolation. Now that he'd taken the first steps, there would be no turning back. First the moon, and later, voyaging among the stars and planets will surely, profoundly alter our lives in many ways. H.G. Wells once wrote, "There is no rest and no end."